Last weekend, I really wanted to play Ratchet & Clank. My options were as follows. 1. I could play the fairly decent but kind of weird PS4 reimagining of the original. 2. I could buy a PlayStation 3, buy the Ratchet collection, and play it on my TV. 3. I could buy a backwards compatible PS3 for double the money and pop in my original. 4. I could emulate the game, but in order to emulate a PS2, I'd have to download the BIOS information from my original PS2 console, which involves modding the console or torrenting it, and then downloading ROMs from less than savory sources. 5. I could pop in my original discs, plug in my original console, and pull out my old CRT TV and sit on the floor. Because pixels don't work the same way as they used to, and if I play a game designed for early flat screen TVs and 2000 CRTs on HD screens, the lines will be way fuzzier and aspect ratios will be way different than what we remembered. In the interest of the purest authenticity and the way the game was originally played, this would probably be the best way. There's a problem here, one that isn't rooted in my laziness or unwillingness to learn how to download my PS2's BIOS information. Emulation isn't sustainable or simple enough to be the sole preserver of a medium like this. Video games like film and marble statues of naked men are art, and like all art, some of it is going to remain unseen by contemporary audiences. But we want to do the best we can to ensure that it's as easy as possible to play and enjoy these games for years to come, right? There are video game museums, sure, which are cool and can work for arcade cabinets, and even shorter earlier titles, but we're not going to stay at the museum for 11 hours in order to play through the Futurama game. But like I said, other options are a challenge. Nintendo, while decent at re-release, has taken a firm stance against retro gaming by shutting down emulation sites and simultaneously ending virtual console support and launching a staggeringly limited equivalent on the Switch. And the mini/classic series or whatever has been pretty cool, but they primarily focus on what's popular and not what's important. A common distinction we see in other mediums like film. Also, Sony just fucked theirs up really bad. And other similar console re-releases like the ones they sell at Walgreens just feel less than legitimate. It's really not ideal for me to fill my shelves and TV stands with mini versions of 20-year-old consoles. And for it to be a stationary library is also a problem because public opinion on art is ever changing. Steam has been great for this, resuscitating interest in long-dead titles for years, but what happens when Steam, ends? I know that seems a little apocalyptic, but you don't own Steam games, and you don't own virtual console titles, which is kind of a huge part of the problem. What I'm trying to pitch, and the point of all this, fear-mongering, is a cross-platform collection of physically re-released games, optimized for modern HD television and a third-party organization dedicated to their preservation. A sort of video game criterion collection, where important, compelling, if not iconic video games can receive re-releases and be enjoyed by history buffs and new players alike. There are, of course, challenges with something like this. Having video game publishers and developers play nice enough to allow for their games to be re-released, especially those that are console exclusive, is about as likely as creative metaphor here.
Can't win them all.
And having a console that can A, handle all of the strange peripherals video games have had, and B, be able to play everything is unlikely. Unlike film and art, video games are one of the only art forms dependent on a dedicated player. Not as in you the player, but something to help you consume the game. Sure, you have a projector or DVD player or putlocker to watch whatever film, but you don't have the Paramount brand VHS player in order to play your copy of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And even if you did, when Paramount releases their new player, they're also going to release a compatible version of Raiders for it. It's just assumed. If I wanted to view a 14th century painting, would I have to buy a 14th century paint viewer device in a used art store on the other side of town and then buy a bunch of adapters to optimize it for modern frames? Of course not. There's like a billion copies out there. Also, Leo isn't busting out of the grave to tell me I'm violating his copyright either, which is fair. But on a similar note, what if Da Vinci was hired to make a painting that tied into a stage play from his time, and now that the license is up, he's no longer allowed to redistribute it? Too bad. Guess we'll never see that painting in a contemporary setting. Like, isn't that weird to say out loud? And so when pitching a Criterion-style collection for the medium, I'm just gonna have to operate under the assumption that there is either A, a console that has become available that has superseded copyright like the Blu-ray player, or B, the consoles that are exclusively owned by a console developer or its subsidiaries under this collection will be released on its most modern console, and will continue to do so at the expense and profit of the collection, not the console developers, to ensure ease of access and an outside investment in preservation. This is not just wish fulfillment on my part, but saves you from having to hear me jump through hoops for the entirety of this video, so that we can have a real conversation about art preservation and not just a legal debate. If you're gonna comment and say,
Well, Nintendo wouldn't allow this very specific situation to happen.
Just know that I'm aware and recognize that while exclusivity is good and necessary for a competitive industry, it also creates challenges and burdens when looking at a medium through a certain lens. Alright, let's do it. Ideally, there'd be 3 types of games that are eligible for the collection. The first one would be at-risk titles. These are games that are considered to be in the most danger of being lost. They come from studios that have since shut down, been bought out, or have licensing issues preventing them from being re-released in a physical format. Goldeneye immediately comes to mind, being a Nintendo exclusive title developed on a now Microsoft-owned Rareware as a tie-in game to a 1998 James Bond film. Without fan ports or kind of okay remakes, it'll be downright impossible to wreck my best friend Tommy at 3 a.m. with a golden gun and facility with paintballs, and make him so mad he pisses his pants on his Space Jam sleeping bag. What I'm saying is, this game mattered, and it'll probably never get remastered and optimized in HD. Something so quintessential to that era of gaming deserves to be experienced by modern audiences, even if it hasn't aged super well. What's charming and what makes Goldeneye important is the way it revolutionized first-person multiplayer shooters, and having something ran in a COD 4 engine with generic assets doesn't really scream effectively recapturing the essence of the title. This category should also extend to other titles which may not receive re-releases because its sequels, spiritual or otherwise, are considered to be the more definitive version. Naturally, Mario Kart comes to mind. While 8 is likely the most complete version, there's still a reason to play 64, and without Virtual Console, there really isn't a good way to do it on a modern system. The goal here is to cut through industry red tape and be focused on the games first. I'm kind of leaving this category a little vague because I want it to apply to games it needs to apply to. If a studio goes out of business and nobody buys up the distribution rights, this collection could pick it up and redistribute it. If a game that's a movie tie-in from years before can no longer be distributed based on the agreement set out during development, this collection could navigate through that issue so that it can see the light of day. You know how 90% of films before 1929 are lost? This category is designed to actively prevent that. Batteries die and dust fills up old cartridges, so while we still can, let's make sure they exist in a way that isn't dependent on piracy. Games that would be considered at risk under the collection would be the original Legend of Zelda, also Eternal Darkness, property of the now defunct and/or disgraced Silicon Knights, Rockstar's 2005 cult hit about the film Warriors, Ico, whose last release was in 2011, 1996 point-and-click gem The Neverhood, and Blade Runner 1997. A game that is not only from a now defunct Westwood Studios, but is also a movie tie-in and was voted most likely to never get re-released despite being critically acclaimed in high school. The second category is technical achievements, which seems pretty self-explanatory, and while this is definitely the non-televised Oscar category of our collection, it's still super important. These are titles that either A, were so innovative that they changed gaming forever, or B, that they utilize the medium in a unique way to change the player experience for the better. Something like the utilization of the console's internal clock to have a boss die of old age like in Metal Gear Solid 3, or rendering 2 different versions of a level, one that's lower quality to convey distance better like Spyro. Even something like Donkey Kong Country, which has startlingly layered sound design that pushed its console to its limits while still creating melodies that are incredible to this very day. Some examples of technical achievements would be games like Wii Sports, despite its eternal curse to remain on Goodwill shelves next to that peripheral from Tony Hawk Ride. Portal, for, being Portal. And Crysis, because a console isn't a console unless it can run Crysis. The third and final category would be games commenting on their respective era. A large way art becomes relevant within its current environment is how it comments on shifting political landscapes. And games, because of their roots in consumerism, often aren't as motivated to make bold statements like films and other art are. But when they do, it's important to ensure these messages can be effectively integrated into the examinations and conversations of that era. Beyond Good and Evil and its commentary on the rise of the information age springs to mind. And games that are actively involved in the discourse is important, and having something that recognizes that, even if it's not the most financially responsible decision, will encourage developers to continue to do so. Games that fall in this category would be Spec Ops: The Line, Psychonauts, and channel favorite Beyond Good and Evil. Hell, even games as recent as Doki Doki Oh god, that was not the time for burps. Hell, even games as recent as Doki Doki Literature Club and What Remains of Edith Finch belong in this category. But what comes with this? Do we just give you the games in its purest form, or do we allow developers to revisit them if they wish? With the Criterion Collection, their primary goal is to have it seen as the auteur would have wished, and so having a game in its original form and its subsequent re-releases and remasters within a singular package would be ideal, along with a variety of behind-the-scenes informations that would allow the player to make his own decision on which version is best. So many games have different versions games as they move from arcade to PC to home console, and having those included would provide the player with the full picture. Even something as simple as the PC version of Quake having a different soundtrack from the N64 release is important to consider while studying it, enjoying it, and placing it within a historical context. It's necessary to prevent a potential George Lucas,
I may have gone too far in a few places,
of the video game industry from only releasing an inferior version of their game and attempting to convince us that it's the only version there is.
Jar Jar is a key to all this.
It isn't. I know Han is the only one that shoots, and I know that Boba Fett sounds like a pirate and not Tamora Morrison. And they're small details, but they're not how the original theater experienced it. And as much as I like seeing games simply remastered, it's important to have them accessible in their original format as well. The Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary Edition is a wonderful way to do this, allowing the player to choose which version they want to play at any time, making it accessible for new audiences while satisfying those who wish to have easier access to the original look they remembered. It's important to remember history, warts and all, and as weird as Cloud's arms look, that's how the medium was at the time. This isn't necessarily an attack on remasters, remakes, or ports, but having the option to choose what version you want to play and putting it in simplistic English like you see with film would be great, and giving the developers the opportunity to revisit their old titles if they wish would encourage their involvement. One of my favorite stories regarding the Super Nintendo Classic was the opportunity for Star Fox 2 to see the light of day, and was a huge selling point for that console. Having translated ports of the Mother series that haven't been seen in America legally released in collectible physical format would be a huge selling point for curious parties without having to resort to overly expensive ports and cartridges and less than legal fan translations. Ocarina of Time is currently only distributed in its 3DS form, and while the changes made would definitely be argued as improvements, there's still reason for the original to exist. And since these titles are older, porting multiple versions into a collection-like format is entirely doable. Donkey Kong Country Returns on the 3DS has an option to play the original Wii version or the 3DS version, and while the changes are far less substantial, it still gave the player the opportunity to pick one version and forget about it. I don't constantly have to think about what would it be like if I had the other version, because it's right there. But with Ocarina, I do. Also, there's some great opportunities for behind the scenes information, recreations of classic manuals, either physical or digital, and potential for documentaries about development and in-depth museum or unique boss rush challenges like the BioShock Collection and the Mega Man Legacy Collection, respectively. On top of that, with added save states, scanline filters, button remapping, and the choice to play in either 16:9 or 4:3 aspect ratios would not only preserve old titles, but also make them accessible to less savvy gamers. Emulation in classic gaming should be more easily accessible to the general public, with tools being provided for a more in-depth experience and analysis if they so wish. What I'm trying to say is that video games matter. They participate in the discourse of their respective era, they allow artists to depict interesting concepts in previously unimaginable ways, and as video games move out of their infancy as a medium and into a full-fledged art form, it's important to consider the best way for us to preserve them for future generations. And maybe a specialized physical release-focused distribution company is the best way. Or maybe there's a better way. One of the main ways people experience video games is buying them through retro stores and websites. It is hands down one of my favorite pastimes, and I don't want this collection to be confused as a replacement. It's not. There will be people out there who seek out black label copies of Metroid Prime or blow the dust off some old lost NES gem. But for the sake of convenience and sustainability, other options should be available to preserve these games as best as we can. And as participants and creators within this medium, it's our responsibility to keep that in mind as we progress. So what are some games that you think need to be preserved? Or do you have a better idea on how we can protect games for future generations? Let me know in the comments below. Also in the description, I've linked some other videos as sort of a further reading section to see where my head was at when I wrote this. They include Nero's video on A World Without Emulation, a GDC from the creator of the Mega Man Legacy Collection, which I consider to be the current standard on building a better game collection, and King K's video on remakes, which came out while I was writing this. That's saying a lot of what I was trying to say, but slightly better. Thank you so much for hearing me out and letting me yell at you about my paranoia, and if you like what you hear, maybe subscribe.